Tiny black twins stand before a judge, their small hands clenched together. They have no lawyer, no family, no one to speak for them. But when one of them looks up, tears in his big brown eyes, and whispers, "Can you be our new mommy?" the entire courtroom falls silent. The judge, known for being cold and unshakable, suddenly feels something crack inside her. Who are these boys? How did they end up here? And why is this powerful woman, the last person who should get involved, now on the verge of risking everything for them? This story will take you on a journey of heartbreak, justice, and the kind of love that defies the law itself. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The heavy wooden gavel cracked through the morning air like thunder, making several people in the courtroom jump. A few papers fluttered to the floor as Judge Evelyn Monroe's voice cut through the silence that followed, as sharp and cold as winter frost. 6 months in county jail. Next case. The young man at the defendant's table seemed to shrink into himself, his shoulders hunching forward as if to shield against the weight of her words. His hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the table. His public defender patted his arm awkwardly before gathering his worn briefcase and scattered documents. Officer Greg Harris, the bailiff who had served in Judge Monroe's courtroom for over a decade, led the defendant away with gentle but firm hands on his shoulders. As he passed the court reporter's desk, he caught the whispered conversation between two longtime staff members, their heads bent close together over steaming paper cups. "She used to be different, you know. Before her son died. Smiled more. Actually talked to people. How long ago was that now? 3 years this coming spring. Poor woman hasn't been the same since." Greg nodded as he walked past, his expression heavy with remembrance. He'd been there for the funeral, a small, gray affair that matched the clouds overhead. The rain had fallen in a steady drizzle, much like the tears that never came to the judge's eyes. He'd watched as Judge Monroe returned to work just 2 days later, her face a mask of composure that hadn't cracked since. But Judge Monroe didn't acknowledge the whispers. She never did. Her fingers, adorned only with a simple gold wedding band that caught the harsh fluorescent light, moved with precise efficiency as she opened the next case file. Her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she scanned the contents, the lenses magnifying her steel gray eyes. Child custody hearing, Liam and Lucas Carter, age 5, she muttered to herself, exhaling sharply. The sound carried no emotion, just another breath, just another case, just another decision to be made in an endless stream of human problems. The courtroom emptied slowly, the shuffle of feet and rustle of papers fading into silence like leaves scattered by an autumn wind. Judge Monroe leaned back in her high-backed leather chair, her fingers pressing against her temples where a familiar ache was building. The morning's fluorescent lights were already giving her a headache, their harsh glare reflecting off the polished wooden surfaces of the courtroom. Quick footsteps approached from her left, the familiar click-clack of sensible heels that belonged to Patricia Reed, her court clerk of 15 years. A steaming cup of black coffee appeared at her elbow, the rich aroma filling the air between them. "You've been at this since 7 a.m., Patricia said softly, her round face creased with concern. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, swaying slightly as she moved. "You should take a break." Without looking up, Judge Monroe's response came automatically, as practiced as breathing. "Breaks are for people who let emotion interfere with judgment. I don't." Patricia's sigh was barely audible as she retreated, leaving the judge alone with the Carter twins' file. The pages told a story she'd seen too many times before: parents dead in a house fire last year. 3 foster homes in 12 months. Current placement in a group home with documented complaints of neglect. Coffee rings stained the corners of several pages, testament to the countless hours social workers had spent documenting the boy's case. Her eyes lingered on the photographs paperclipped to the file. 2 identical faces stared back at her, dark hair, green eyes, small features that still carried baby roundness. One boy's expression was guarded, protective, his tiny jaw set in determination beyond his years. The others showed a vulnerability that made something deep in her chest twinge, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. She pushed the feeling away immediately, straightening the photos with precise movements. Judge Monroe had stopped believing she could fix the system long ago. There were too many cases, too many children, too many flaws in a machine that was supposed to protect the vulnerable but often left them more wounded than before. She'd learned the hard way that caring too much only led to disappointment, or worse. The memory of her own loss threatened to surface, but she pushed it down with practiced efficiency. Taking a long sip of the coffee Patricia had brought, she straightened her shoulders beneath her black robe. Her spine aligned with the tall chair behind her like a sword being returned to its scabbard, rigid, proper, ready. The fabric of her robe rustled with the movement, a sound as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Send them in," she called out, her voice carrying the same detached authority it had held all morning. The words echoed slightly in the nearly empty courtroom. The heavy courtroom doors began to open with a familiar creak, and Judge Monroe prepared herself for what was supposed to be just another custody hearing, just another case to be decided with cool, impartial judgment. But something about those photographs nagged at her carefully maintained composure, like a loose thread threatening to unravel a tightly woven fabric. The heavy courtroom doors creaked open, and all heads turned to watch as Melissa Grant, a social worker with dark circles under her eyes and a stack of worn folders tucked under her arm, guided two small figures into the room. The twin boys couldn't have been more than 5 years old, their tiny hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Their clothes were clearly hand-me-downs. One wore a faded blue sweater that hung past his fingertips, while the other's pants had a small tear at the knee and frayed hems that dragged on the floor. Judge Evelyn Monroe barely glanced up from her papers, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "State the case," she commanded, her voice maintaining its practiced detachment, the same tone she'd used in thousands of cases before. Melissa shifted her weight from one sensible shoe to the other, speaking in the tired tone of someone who had given this speech too many times before. Liam and Lucas Carter, age 5. Parents died in a house fire last year. They've been through 3 foster homes and are currently in the Golden Grove group home. The last placement ended when the foster parents separated. "And your recommendation?" Evelyn asked, still not looking at the children, focusing instead on the manila folder before her. "We recommend maintaining their current placement, Your Honor. At least until we can find something more suitable." Now Evelyn did look up, her eyebrow arching as she removed her glasses. "The same placement that has multiple complaints of neglect on file? Including reports of children going hungry?" Melissa's professional facade cracked slightly as she shifted uncomfortably, clutching her folders closer to her chest. "We're severely understaffed, Your Honor. Resources are limited, and our waiting list for foster families grows longer every day. We're doing the best we can with what we have." Evelyn's jaw clenched at the familiar excuse, her fingers drumming silently against the bench. She'd heard it countless times before: too many cases, not enough social workers, limited funding. The same bureaucratic dance that left children falling through the cracks of a system meant to protect them. Finally, she allowed herself to really look at the twins. They stood close together, like two saplings sharing the same roots, their shoulders touching. Their big brown eyes darted around the courtroom, taking in the towering ceiling with its fluorescent lights, the heavy wooden furniture, the stern-faced adults in their formal attire. One boy, she wasn't sure which was Liam and which was Lucas, had his thumb hovering near his mouth, as if fighting the urge to suck it, while his other hand gripped his brother's sleeve. "Do they have any living relatives?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer would disappoint her. It always did in cases like these. Melissa shrugged, flipping through her dog-eared notes. "None suitable. We found some distant relatives in Ohio, but they were either unfit or unwilling to take the boys. One aunt said she already had too many mouths to feed." The twins remained silent throughout this exchange, their eyes growing wider with each word. Then, suddenly, one of them broke away from his brother's grip, his worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Before anyone could react, he darted forward, his small hand reaching out to grasp the bottom of Evelyn's black robe, the fabric bunching in his tiny fist. "Can you be our new mommy?" The words hung in the air like suspended raindrops, echoing in the sudden stillness. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by a heavy silence that seemed to press against the walls. Even the usual shuffling of papers ceased, and the court reporter's fingers froze over her keyboard. Evelyn felt as if all the air had been sucked from her lungs. She stared down at the little boy, Liam. She realized from the small crescent-shaped birthmark near his ear that was noted in his file. His brown eyes looked up at her with a mixture of hope and fear, his lower lip trembling slightly as he waited for her answer. Behind him, Lucas took a hesitant step forward, drawn to his brother like a magnet, his own eyes filling with tears that threatened to spill onto his cheeks. His small hands twisted the hem of his oversized sweater nervously. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her gavel until her knuckles turned white, the wood smooth and familiar against her palm. Her heart thundered in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, not since that terrible night. Something deep inside her chest began to crack, a dangerous hairline fracture in the wall she'd so carefully built around her heart since Samuel's death. But she couldn't afford to feel. Not now. Not ever again. She had to shut this down before these two little boys with their pleading eyes and trembling lips could chip away any more of her carefully constructed defenses. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft sound of Lucas's whimpers against his brother's shoulder. Liam's small fingers remained twisted in the thick fabric of Evelyn's black robe, his wide brown eyes fixed on her face with a desperate hope that made her chest tighten uncomfortably. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn carpet. "Your Honor." Melissa Grant cleared her throat, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Her sensible shoes squeaked against the floor. "Can we proceed?" Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she pulled back from Liam's grip. She forced her voice to remain steady, professional, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I am not a candidate for guardianship. This is a legal proceeding." The words felt like stones in her mouth, heavy and cold, each syllable a betrayal of the emotion threatening to crack her carefully maintained facade. Liam's lower lip began to quiver, and tears welled up in his eyes, making them shine like polished amber. "But we don't want to go back." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the silent courtroom like a thunderclap. Lucas pressed closer to his brother, his small shoulders shaking. Evelyn inhaled sharply, her fingers pressing hard against the smooth wood of her desk until her knuckles turned white. Everything in her training, everything she'd built over the past 15 years, told her to deny their request, make her ruling, and move on to the next case. It was simple. Clinical. Safe. The path she'd walked countless times before. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way Lucas clung to his brother like a lifeline, his small fists bunched in Liam's threadbare sweater. Maybe it was the resigned look in Melissa's eyes, as if she'd already written these children off as just another case number. Or maybe it was something deeper, something Evelyn had buried so far down she'd almost forgotten it existed, a memory of another little boy's tears, of promises left unfulfilled. She turned her piercing gaze to Melissa, noting how the social worker's perfectly pressed blazer couldn't hide her impatience. "I'm postponing my ruling. I want a full report on their current placement by tomorrow." Her voice carried the weight of authority she'd cultivated over years on the bench, each word precise and measured. Melissa's face twisted in surprise and irritation, her perfectly plucked eyebrows drawing together. "That's unnecessary, Your Honor. The home is fine. That is not your decision." Evelyn's voice dropped to a dangerous edge that made even the bailiff straighten up. The social worker took an involuntary step backward, clutching her folders closer to her chest like a shield. Gasps rippled through the courtroom again. Officer Harris, who had seen Judge Monroe handle thousands of cases, raised an eyebrow in surprise. Patricia Reed, her court clerk, stopped typing mid-sentence, her fingers frozen over the keyboard, the usual tap-tap-tap of keys falling silent. But Evelyn didn't care about their reactions. She couldn't shake the image of these two small boys, dressed in ill-fitting clothes that hung loose on their thin frames, clutching each other like they were the only solid thing in their world. The file in front of her showed a pattern: 3 foster homes in less than a year, each placement shorter than the last, each move another crack in their fragile world. Something wasn't right. She lifted her gavel, its familiar weight now somehow different in her hand, heavier with the weight of what she was about to do. "This hearing is suspended pending further investigation. I expect that report on my desk by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, Ms. Grant." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that made Lucas jump and burrow deeper into his brother's side. Her fingers trembled as they released the gavel, but she kept her face impassive, refusing to acknowledge the storm brewing inside her chest. The same storm that had been building since the moment these two boys had walked into her courtroom and awakened something she thought had died years ago. The heavy front door clicked shut behind Evelyn as she stepped into her darkened house. The silence wrapped around her like a thick, suffocating blanket, broken only by the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Her heels made a soft thud as she slipped them off, leaving them neatly aligned by the door, a habit born from years of rigid routine. The hardwood floors felt cool and unyielding beneath her stockinged feet as she made her way to the kitchen. Everything was exactly where it should be, pristine and organized, a reflection of the order she craved in her life. She reached for the cabinet above the sink, pulling out a delicate crystal wine glass that caught the dim light filtering through the windows, casting a warm glow across her weary features. The wine bottle made a gentle gurgling sound as she poured, the deep red liquid swirling and dancing in the glass. But as she lifted it to her lips, a small voice echoed in her mind, clear as if it were right beside her. "Can you be our new mommy?" The words struck her like a physical blow, shattering the fragile calm she had sought to reclaim. Her fingers clenched around the stem of the glass, knuckles turning white with the intensity of her grip. The wine trembled, threatening to spill over the rim. She set it down quickly, afraid she might actually break the delicate crystal, shattering it into 1,000 irreparable pieces, just as her heart felt shattered in that moment. Those eyes. Those tiny, hopeful faces. They wouldn't leave her mind, haunting her with the memory of the child she had once loved and lost. Without conscious thought, her feet carried her down the hallway toward her bedroom, as if drawn by an invisible force. The plush carpet muffled her steps as she approached the closet. Her hands shook slightly as she knelt down, reaching far into the back corner where a plain cardboard shoebox lay untouched for years. Dust had gathered on the lid, and she wiped it away with trembling fingers. Inside, protected by tissue paper, lay a single photograph. The edges were worn soft from handling, though she hadn't looked at it in so long. A little boy smiled up at her from the glossy surface. His golden curls caught the sunlight, his blue eyes crinkled with joy, showing off a gap where his front teeth should have been. Samuel. Her beautiful boy. The memories crashed over her like a tidal wave, overwhelming her senses and dragging her back into the depths of her grief. The day he lost those teeth, how proud he'd been to put them under his pillow. The way he'd laugh when she chased him around the backyard. The soft weight of him in her arms that final morning, when she'd hugged him goodbye before school, never knowing it would be the last time. Pain ripped through her chest, as fresh and raw as it had been 15 years ago. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. "I can't do this again," she whispered, her voice rough and broken in the darkness. The photograph trembled in her hands. Those two little boys today, Liam and Lucas, they needed someone. Just like Samuel had needed her. But she'd built these walls for a reason. She couldn't bear to feel this kind of pain again. "I can't do this," she repeated into the empty room. But the words felt hollow, uncertain. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't sure she believed herself. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds in Evelyn's chambers as she set down a fresh stack of case files on her polished mahogany desk. Each manila folder represented another decision, another life to consider, another burden she'd learned to carry with practiced detachment. Her fingers moved mechanically to open the first one, but her eyes kept drifting to the lone file sitting apart from the others, Liam and Lucas Carter. She inhaled deeply, straightening her black judicial robe with practiced precision. "Focus," she muttered to herself, smoothing away an invisible wrinkle. But the twins' faces kept appearing in her mind, their frightened brown eyes, their trembling hands clasped together, the way they seemed to lean into each other as if the world might tear them apart at any moment. With an irritated sigh, she reached for their file instead. The pages inside were worn, as if passed through too many hands that didn't care enough to be gentle. Coffee stains marked several corners, and the edges were dog-eared and frayed. Her eyes narrowed as she read through the initial report again, this time more carefully, her index finger tracing each line of text. The group home, Sunshine Children's Center, had accumulated 17 complaints in the past year alone. Inadequate meals, she read aloud softly, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Children reporting harsh physical discipline. Multiple instances of nighttime neglect. Her stomach tightened as she noticed a pattern, complaints filed, then mysteriously dropped without investigation, each one dismissed with the same vague notation, insufficient evidence. She pressed the intercom button with more force than necessary. "Patricia, get me Melissa Grant. Now. Tell her it's urgent." 20 minutes later, Melissa walked in, her heels clicking against the floor with obvious annoyance, the sound echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Your Honor, I have other cases. Sit down, Evelyn cut her off, her voice sharp as steel, leaving no room for argument. She held up the report, its pages fanned out like evidence in an indictment. Explain this to me. 17 complaints in 12 months, and not a single proper investigation. Not one. Melissa shifted in her chair, smoothing her rumpled blazer with nervous fingers. As I explained yesterday, we're severely understaffed. We can't chase down every little complaint from kids who are just acting out. Acting out? Evelyn's voice dropped dangerously low, carrying the weight of years on the bench. Is that what you call reports of children going hungry? Of unauthorized physical punishment? Do you even read these complaints before dismissing them? You don't understand how the system works, Melissa said, her tone dismissive, though a slight tremor in her hands betrayed her unease. These group homes are all we have. If we investigate every complaint, we risk losing placement options altogether. Sometimes we have to make compromises. Evelyn's knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of her desk, the polished wood cool beneath her fingers. And what happens, she said slowly, each word precise and cutting, like a surgeon's blade, when a little complaint turns into another dead child? The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Melissa's face paled slightly, but she avoided Evelyn's gaze, staring instead at her own clasped hands, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. Evelyn waited, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably, the tick of the wall clock marking each passing second. When Melissa offered no response, she closed the file with a decisive snap that made the social worker flinch. Something wasn't right here, something that went beyond normal bureaucratic negligence. The pattern was too neat, too consistent to be mere incompetence. She stood up, reaching for her coat and car keys hanging on the brass hook by her door. The metal felt cold in her palm, grounding her. She needed to see this place for herself, to look beyond the paperwork and into the reality these children faced every day. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the weathered facade of the group home as Evelyn's black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Her heels crunched on broken concrete as she made her way through an overgrown lawn, where weeds pushed through cracks like desperate fingers reaching for light. Dead leaves from last autumn still littered the corners of the yard, forgotten and untended. The building itself seemed to sag under its own weight. Paint peeled from the wooden siding in long strips, and dark stains marked where rain had seeped through the aging roof. The windows, clouded with years of grime, stared back at her like tired eyes. A broken shutter hung at a crooked angle, tapping against the wall with each gust of wind. A sharp knock brought hurried footsteps, and the door creaked open to reveal Cynthia Marsh, the group home director. Her thin lips pressed into a tight line as she recognized Evelyn. The woman's cardigan had food stains down the front, and her hair looked unwashed. Didn't expect a judge to come knocking unannounced, Cynthia said, her voice carrying an edge of irritation. The smell of stale cigarette smoke wafted from inside. Evelyn stepped past her into a dim hallway. The musty air hit her immediately, a mix of mildew and something else, something that made her stomach turn. In a corner of what passed for a living room, 3 children sat on a threadbare carpet, listlessly pushing around broken crayons. They didn't even look up at her entrance, their shoulders hunched as if trying to make themselves invisible. I'm here to inspect the facility, Evelyn stated, her trained eye taking in every detail. Water stains marked the ceiling. A broken window was covered with cardboard. The furniture looked salvaged from curbside throwaway piles. A torn couch cushion leaked stuffing onto the floor. We manage with what we have, Cynthia said defensively, following Evelyn as she moved through the house. Her shoes squeaked against the grimy linoleum. The kitchen told its own story. Cupboard doors hung crooked on loose hinges. When Evelyn opened them, she found mostly empty shelves with a few dented cans and boxes of generic pasta. Dirty dishes were piled high in a sink with dripping faucets, and a strange smell emanated from the ancient refrigerator. I need to see Liam and Lucas Carter, Evelyn said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Her fingers clenched involuntarily at her sides. Cynthia's hesitation was brief but noticeable. This way, she muttered, leading Evelyn upstairs. Each step groaned under their weight. The twins' room was barely large enough for the single bed they shared. The mattress sagged in the middle, covered by a blanket so thin it was almost transparent. Liam and Lucas sat perfectly still on the edge of the bed, their small bodies rigid with tension. A single bare light bulb dangled from a wire overhead, casting harsh shadows across their pale faces. That's when Evelyn noticed the bruises. Dark marks wrapped around Liam's upper arm like purple fingers. Her throat tightened. She could make out older yellowing bruises beneath his sleeve. "Where did you get that?" she asked gently, kneeling to meet his eyes. The floor creaked beneath her knees. Liam flinched at the question, drawing slightly closer to Lucas. His eyes darted to Cynthia before fixing on the floor. Lucas's hand found his brother's, squeezing tight. Cynthia's laugh cut through the silence like broken glass. "Kids are clumsy. They fall. You know how boys are." She shifted her weight from foot to foot, arms crossed defensively over her chest. Evelyn felt heat rise in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears. The excuses were too familiar, too practiced. She'd heard them countless times in her courtroom from people trying to explain away the inexplicable. Her jaw clenched so tight it hurt. She turned to face the twins again, and Liam's eyes finally met hers. His small voice came out barely above a whisper, "Please. Don't leave us here." Lucas nodded silently beside him, tears gathering in his eyes. Without another word, Evelyn turned on her heel and stormed out. Her footsteps echoed through the hollow halls as she marched toward the exit. She had seen enough, more than enough. The rage building inside her was almost blinding, but beneath it lay an iron determination. These boys wouldn't spend another night in this place. The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds in thin strips as Evelyn Monroe burst through her chamber doors. Her footsteps echoed like thunderclaps against the polished floor, and her normally perfect posture radiated fury. She clutched a thick manila folder in her hands, her knuckles white with tension, the edges of the paper crumpling beneath her grip. Patricia Reed looked up from her desk, startled by her boss's explosive entrance. A stack of papers scattered as she jumped. Before she could speak, Evelyn slammed the formal motion onto her desk with enough force to make her coffee mug rattle and spill drops of dark liquid onto nearby documents. "I want these children out of that place today." Evelyn's voice was sharp as steel, each word precise and cutting. Patricia picked up the document, her eyes widening as she scanned its contents, her face growing paler with each line she read. "An emergency removal? That's a big step, Your Honor. The paperwork alone could take days to process." "I don't care," Evelyn snapped, pacing the room like a caged tiger. Her heels clicked a frantic rhythm on the floor. "They are not staying there another night." Her usually controlled demeanor had cracked, revealing raw emotion underneath. The careful mask she'd worn for years was slipping. Within the hour, Evelyn had filed the emergency request with Child Services, pushing it through every available channel. She sat at her desk, drumming her fingers against the wooden surface, leaving small marks in the polish when her phone rang. The caller ID displayed Leonard Graves, Senior Director. Her jaw clenched at the sight of his name. Judge Monroe, his voice oozed false politeness, smooth as honey but twice as sticky. "I received your rather aggressive filing this morning." "Then you know why I'm doing this," Evelyn replied, her tone ice cold, matching his false courtesy with steel. "We have protocols in place," Leonard said, his calm voice carrying an edge of warning, like a knife wrapped in silk. "Protocols that exist for a reason. You can't just swoop in and—" "Your protocols," Evelyn cut him off, gritting her teeth so hard her jaw ached, "have failed these children. I've seen the bruises, Leonard. I've seen the neglect. The system you're so proud of is destroying them. Be reasonable, Evelyn." Leonard's voice hardened, dropping all pretense of friendliness. "You're making waves where you shouldn't. Drop this, or you're going to make enemies. Powerful ones. People who won't forget." Evelyn stood up from her desk, her free hand clenched into a fist so tight her manicured nails dug into her palm. "Is that a threat, Leonard? Consider it friendly advice. We all remember what happened with your son. Don't let personal feelings cloud your judgment." Again. His words dripped with calculated cruelty. The mention of Samuel sent a jolt through her chest, a familiar pain that never truly faded, but instead of backing down, it only fueled her resolve. "Those children need help, and I'm not backing down. Not this time. Not ever." "You're making a mistake," Leonard warned, his voice now pure ice. "No." Evelyn's voice was steel, tempered by years of buried grief and anger. "The mistake was letting this go on for so long. I'm done looking the other way. This ends now. The line went dead as Leonard hung up. Evelyn slammed the phone down, her hands trembling with rage and determination. She looked at the twins' file on her desk, at their small faces in the attached photos, their eyes holding the same fear she'd seen in Samuel's. This wasn't just another case file anymore, another number to process through the system. This was war. And Evelyn Monroe was ready to fight, no matter the cost to her career or herself. Some battles were worth losing everything for. The streetlights cast moving shadows across Liam and Lucas's faces as they sat pressed together in the back seat of the social worker's car. Their small hands remained tightly clasped, knuckles white with tension, fingers intertwined like they'd been since breakfast. Neither boy had spoken since leaving the group home, their wide brown eyes fixed on the passing city lights that blurred into streaks of gold and red against the darkening sky. Tina Dawson adjusted her rearview mirror, catching glimpses of the twins. Her heart ached at their obvious fear, at the way they huddled together like frightened birds. "We're taking you somewhere safer, sweethearts," she said softly, trying to sound cheerful despite the heaviness in her chest. The boys didn't respond. Lucas buried his face deeper into his brother's shoulder, his shoulders trembling slightly, while Liam's watchful gaze never left the window, scanning each passing car as if searching for danger. Their matching blue t-shirts, both a size too big and worn soft from many washes, hung loosely on their thin frames, the sleeves reaching past their elbows. After 20 minutes of silent driving through neighborhoods that grew steadily nicer, they pulled up to a 2-story house with warm yellow light spilling from its windows. Flower boxes hung beneath each windowsill, filled with bright petunias that seemed to glow in the evening light, their purple and pink blooms nodding in the gentle breeze. The front porch light was on, casting a welcoming glow on the wooden swing that swayed gently, its chains creaking softly. Margaret and David Walker stood waiting at the door, their silhouettes framed by the porch light. They were an older couple, probably in their 60s, with kind faces and gentle movements that spoke of years of patience. Margaret's silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a floral apron dusted with flour, the scent of fresh baking following her like a cloud. As Tina helped the boys out of the car, their sneakers scuffing against the concrete, Margaret approached slowly, careful not to move too quickly or make any sudden gestures. She knelt down to their level, her warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled, hands folded carefully in her lap. "Would you like some cookies? I just pulled them out of the oven. They're still warm." The twins shifted uncertainly, their shoulders touching as they stood together, two small figures against the gathering dusk. The smell of fresh baked chocolate chip cookies wafted from the house, rich and tempting, but neither boy made a move toward it. Lucas tugged at his brother's sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper, trembling with worry. "Do you think she'll come back?" Liam's eyes darted around the unfamiliar surroundings, taking in every detail, his expression guarded and wary. He shrugged at his brother's question, but his gaze kept returning to the window, as if searching for someone they both knew wouldn't appear. David stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, carrying the boys' small backpacks, everything they owned in the world packed into 2 worn bags with faded superhero logos. "Let's get you settled in," he said kindly, his voice gentle as summer rain. "Your room has bunk beds. You can choose who gets the top bunk." Still, the twins hesitated at the threshold of their temporary home, neither willing to be the first to step inside. Before following Margaret into the house, Lucas reached out and grabbed Tina's sleeve with trembling fingers, his small hand catching the fabric. His voice was so quiet she had to lean down to hear him, his words barely a breath. "Please don't forget us," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears that caught the porch light like tiny stars. Tina swallowed hard, fighting back her own emotion as she watched the small boys finally step into the house, still holding hands, still uncertain of their place in the world, their shadows merging into one on the welcome mat beneath their feet. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Evelyn sat at her marble countertop, a full glass of red wine untouched before her. Shadows stretched across the empty room, broken only by the dim light above the stove. Her finger traced the rim of the glass, but she couldn't bring herself to take a sip. The Cabernet's rich aroma wafted up, usually inviting, but tonight just another reminder of her solitude. Usually, this quiet moment was her favorite part of the day. The silence meant peace, control, order. But tonight, it felt different. Heavy. Suffocating. The emptiness of her house seemed to mock her with memories of laughter long silenced. Each tick of the clock echoed like a hammer against her carefully constructed walls. Her eyes drifted to the hallway where Samuel's photos used to hang. She'd taken them down years ago, unable to bear his smiling face watching her every day. Now, the blank walls felt like an accusation. The faint outlines of where the frames had been still showed on the paint, ghostly rectangles that refused to fade completely. Liam's bruised arm flashed in her mind, purple marks against brown skin, his tiny body flinching away from questions. Then Lucas's wide, frightened eyes, clinging to his brother like a lifeline. Their voices echoed in her head, a haunting chorus she couldn't silence. The image of their small shoulders hunched against the world wouldn't leave her. Please don't leave us here. Please don't forget us. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone. Patricia would still be awake. Her clerk always worked late, fueled by coffee and dedication. One call, and she could check on the boys, make sure they were settling in at the Walkers' home. Her thumb hovered over the contact, trembling slightly in the dim light. But what then? What would that mean? The implications of such a simple action terrified her. She set the phone down and picked it up again. Hina Dawson's number was right there. The social worker had promised to send updates. It wouldn't be inappropriate to ask for one now, would it? The screen's blue glow illuminated her uncertain expression. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the counter. Evelyn pushed back from the kitchen island, her chair scraping against the tile floor. She couldn't do this. She couldn't let herself care. Caring meant pain, and she'd built her walls too high to let it in again. Years of careful distance threatened to crumble with each thought of those boys. Her feet carried her upstairs, each step heavy with the weight of memories she'd tried so hard to bury. The hallway seemed longer tonight, darker. The mirror hung there like always, but she turned her head away as she passed. She couldn't face her reflection, couldn't bear to see the woman she'd become staring back at her. The hardened eyes, the stern set of her mouth, a mask she'd perfected over the years. Standing in her doorway, hand on the knob, a thought slipped through her defenses. What if she'd never really stopped being a mother? What if she'd just gotten better at pretending she wasn't one anymore? The question settled deep in her chest, an uncomfortable truth she couldn't dismiss. She closed the door behind her, but the question followed her inside, as persistent as the memory of two small boys who needed someone to fight for them. Evelyn's silver BMW rolled to a stop in front of the Walkers' modest two-story home. Her knuckles were white against the steering wheel as she stared at the cheerful yellow door and well-tended flower beds, where purple and yellow pansies nodded in the afternoon breeze. This was just a routine follow-up, she told herself. Nothing more than ensuring proper placement after an emergency removal. A standard part of her duties as a family court judge. So why did her heart race like this? She smoothed her black pencil skirt and straightened her navy blazer before walking up the concrete path, her heels clicking steadily against the stone. The doorbell chimed softly, and Margaret Walker appeared moments later, her round face breaking into a warm smile, crow's feet crinkling at her eyes. Judge Monroe. What a lovely surprise, Margaret said, opening the door wider. Please, come in. The house smelled like fresh-baked cookies and furniture polish, warm and inviting in a way that made Evelyn's chest ache with half-forgotten memories. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the hardwood floors that had been worn smooth by years of family life. Would you like some tea? Margaret offered, gesturing toward the kitchen where the remnants of an afternoon snack still dotted the counter. No, thank you, Evelyn replied, her voice carefully measured to maintain professional distance. I'm here to check on the boys. As if on cue, two small faces peeked around the living room doorway. Lucas's eyes widened with recognition, a tiny smile tugging at his lips, while Liam hung back slightly, watching her with that same guarded expression she'd seen in court, his shoulders tense and ready to retreat. Margaret walked over to the refrigerator, covered in colorful drawings held up by alphabet magnets in various states of wear. They've been keeping busy, she said softly, her voice gentle with understanding. I think they feel safe here. She tapped one picture showing what looked like a house with 4 stick figures in front, surrounded by fluffy clouds and a bright yellow sun. Lucas drew this yesterday. Evelyn knelt down beside the boys, her usual stern demeanor softening despite herself, the mask of judicial authority slipping just a fraction. Are they treating you well here? she asked gently. Lucas nodded eagerly, bouncing slightly on his toes, but Liam's fingers worried at his sleeve cuffs, his eyes downcast and focused on the floor. Something in that gesture made Evelyn's chest tighten painfully. Samuel used to do the same thing when he was troubled but trying to be brave, twisting the fabric until it frayed. "Would you like to show Judge Monroe your drawings?" Margaret encouraged, touching Liam's shoulder lightly, careful not to startle him. Lucas grabbed Evelyn's hand, his tiny fingers warm and trusting, and pulled her toward the refrigerator with childish enthusiasm. "I made this one," he said, pointing to another picture. "It's a puppy." The drawing showed a brown blob with 4 legs and a happy red smile. Evelyn studied each drawing carefully, noting how Liam showed more detail but darker colors, houses with shadowed windows and trees without leaves, while Lucas's were bright and simple, filled with hearts and sunshine. Their artwork told a story their words couldn't yet express, speaking volumes about their emotional state. When she finally stood to leave, her knees protesting slightly from kneeling so long on the hard floor, Lucas's small hand caught the hem of her coat. His brown eyes looked up at her, full of hope and fear, reflecting a desperate need for stability. "Will you come back?" The question hung in the air like a delicate soap bubble. Evelyn felt the familiar urge to retreat, to maintain professional distance, to protect herself from caring too much. But something else stirred inside her, something she thought had died with Samuel, a warmth she'd locked away years ago. She hesitated, then nodded once. Evelyn's silver pen trembled in her hand as Leonard Graves's voice crackled through her office phone. Her chambers, usually a sanctuary of order and control, suddenly felt smaller, more confining. The afternoon sunlight filtering through the Venetian blinds cast prison bar shadows across her desk. "Judge Monroe, this is Leonard Graves." His tone was smooth, practiced, the voice of someone used to wielding power. She could almost picture his self-satisfied smile through the phone line. "Mr. Graves." Evelyn kept her voice level, professional, even as her stomach knotted. She set down the case file she'd been reviewing, giving him her full attention. The manila folder was worn at the edges from her constant handling. "I understand you've been causing quite a stir with the Carter twins case." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like an executioner's axe. "Several people are concerned about your involvement." Evelyn's jaw tightened until she could feel the tension in her temples. The conditions at that group home warranted immediate action. Her fingers drummed against the leather of her chair armrest. "That wasn't your call to make." His voice hardened to granite. "You're meddling where you shouldn't be, Judge Monroe. The group home has filed a formal complaint against you. They're claiming harassment, abuse of power." "Harassment?" Evelyn's voice rose slightly, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "I documented clear evidence of neglect and possible abuse." The memory of dirty mattresses and empty refrigerators flashed through her mind. Evidence that wasn't properly collected or processed. Graves's tone turned patronizing, like he was speaking to an errant child. "You overstepped your bounds, showed bias, and interfered with established protocols." Evelyn gripped her pen so tightly it nearly snapped in half, the metal digging into her palm. "Are you suggesting I should have ignored signs of child abuse? I'm suggesting you remember your place." His words carried a clear warning, sharp as broken glass. "If you don't back off, Judge Monroe, you might find yourself at the center of an ethics investigation. Your emotional involvement in this case raises serious questions about your judgment." Heat rose in Evelyn's chest, burning like acid. "Are you threatening me? I'm reminding you who runs this system." The words fell like ice. "Don't force my hand on this, Judge Monroe. Some battles aren't worth fighting." The line went dead with a sharp click that seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. Evelyn sat motionless, the dial tone buzzing in her ear like an angry wasp. Slowly, she placed the receiver back in its cradle, each movement deliberate and controlled. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage. The same system she'd devoted her life to was now trying to silence her for doing what was right. She looked around her chambers, at the law degrees on the wall, their gold seals catching the afternoon light, the carefully organized files in their labeled folders, the polished wooden desk that had been her anchor for over a decade. Everything in its proper place, everything controlled and ordered. Just like she'd kept her life for the past 15 years. But now that control was slipping through her fingers like water. Because of two little boys who needed someone to fight for them. Because she wouldn't, look the other way while they suffered. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of Graves's threats pressing down on her shoulders like lead. An ethics investigation could end her career. Everything she'd built, every careful step up the ladder, could come crashing down in an instant. But she'd seen Liam's bruises, purple yellow marks that no child should ever wear. She'd witnessed Lucas's fear, the way he flinched at sudden movements. She'd walked through that neglected group home and seen the system's failures with her own eyes, breathed in the stale air of indifference. She couldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. Some battles were worth any cost. The evening air carried a gentle chill as Evelyn's car crunched over gravel, pulling into the small cemetery's parking lot. Her headlights swept across rows of headstones before she cut the engine, plunging everything into darkness. The silence pressed in around her like a heavy blanket. For several long minutes, she sat motionless, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, her wedding ring catching what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. "Come on, Evelyn," she whispered to herself, her breath fogging the window slightly. "You've avoided this long enough." The car door creaked as she stepped out, her heels sinking slightly into the damp grass. A distant owl called mournfully into the night. In her hand, she clutched a single white rose, its petals pristine against the growing shadows, dewdrops clinging to its delicate surface. The path to Samuel's grave was familiar, even after all these years, every marker and tree etched into her memory. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if invisible weights were attached to her feet. Samuel James Monroe, the headstone read. Beloved son. The dates carved below showed a life cut tragically short, just 5 years, 3 months, and 12 days. The polished granite reflected the dim light, making the letters seem to shimmer. Evelyn's legs trembled as she knelt before the grave, her designer skirt soaking up the evening moisture. The white rose trembled in her hand as she placed it gently against the cool stone. Her fingers reached out, tracing each letter of his name with painful tenderness, feeling every groove and contour of the carved letters. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat like a trapped bird. "There are these two little boys." She paused, struggling to find words, her throat tight with emotion. "They're your age. Would have been your age." The wind stirred the trees overhead, sending leaves dancing across the cemetery grounds in gentle spirals. Evelyn closed her eyes, drawing in a shaky breath. The scent of fresh cut grass and evening dew filled her lungs, mingling with the sweet fragrance of nearby flowering shrubs. "Would I have been enough for you?" The question that had haunted her for 15 years finally escaped her lips, hanging heavy in the twilight air. "If I had been more present, more attentive. Would you still be here?" Tears she'd held back for years began to fall, dotting the grass beneath her knees. The carefully constructed walls around her heart cracked and crumbled, letting loose a flood of suppressed grief and guilt. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. "These boys, Samuel. They need someone to fight for them. But I'm scared." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper, raw with emotion. "I'm terrified of loving again. Of failing again." She stayed there, kneeling in the growing darkness, until her legs ached and her tears ran dry. The evening had deepened to night, stars beginning to peek through breaks in the clouds. Finally, she pushed herself to her feet, brushing grass from her skirt with trembling hands. Looking down at the headstone one last time, she squared her shoulders, drawing strength from a well she thought had run dry years ago. "I won't fail them, Samuel," she said firmly, her voice stronger now. "Not like I failed you." And for the first time in 15 years, she meant it. The promise settled into her heart, taking root like a seed of hope in fertile soil. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Walkers' driveway as Evelyn's car rolled to a stop. She'd driven here without really thinking about it, her hands seemingly steering of their own accord. Now, sitting in her parked car, she struggled to justify her presence. This wasn't a formal visit. There were no papers to sign, no official business to conduct. The neat folder of documents that usually accompanied her lay untouched on her desk at home. "What am I doing here?" she muttered, smoothing her casual weekend blouse. It felt strange not wearing her judge's robes. The soft cotton against her skin was a reminder that today she wasn't Judge Monroe, she was just Evelyn, and that thought made her oddly vulnerable. The sound of children's shrieks drew her attention to the backyard. Not screams of fear or pain, but joy. Pure, unrestrained happiness that echoed off the surrounding houses. Something inside her chest tightened, a familiar ache she usually tried to ignore. Margaret Walker opened the front door before Evelyn could even knock, as if she'd been watching for visitors. Judge Monroe. What a lovely surprise. Her warm smile held no judgment about the unexpected visit, only genuine welcome that made Evelyn's tension ease slightly. I was just in the neighborhood, Evelyn said lamely, knowing how transparent the excuse sounded. She couldn't even convince herself with that one. Of course, Margaret nodded, eyes twinkling with understanding. Come around back. The boys are enjoying this beautiful weather. Her gentle tone suggested she knew exactly why Evelyn had really come. They walked through the house to the back patio, where the scene before them made Evelyn pause. Liam and Lucas darted through arcs of water from a sprinkler, their t-shirts soaked, their faces bright with excitement. Liam chased his brother, both of them dodging the water jets like it was an elaborate game. Their wet hair stuck to their foreheads, and their bare feet left tiny prints on the sun-warmed concrete. Margaret handed Evelyn a tall glass of fresh lemonade, condensation already beating on the outside. They've been happier since you last came, she said softly. Lucas asks about you every day. First thing in the morning, usually. Evelyn's throat felt tight as she watched Liam catch up to his brother, wrapping his arms around Lucas's middle. They tumbled onto the grass together, their laughter pure and uninhibited. It was such a stark contrast to the frightened, silent boys she'd first met in her courtroom. Back then, they'd barely looked up from the floor, clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. Watch me. Watch me. Lucas called out, noticing Evelyn. He ran through the sprinkler again, arms spread wide, face tilted up to catch the drops. Water sparkled around him like diamonds in the sunlight, creating a momentary rainbow in the spray. Before she could step back, Lucas bounded over to her, dripping wet and radiating joy. Come play with us. His brown eyes shone with hope and trust, melting something frozen inside her chest. Evelyn felt her lips curve upward, not the practiced, professional smile she wore in court, but something real and warm that started in her heart and worked its way outward. I should stay dry, she said gently, touching his damp hair. But, thank you for the invitation. Lucas didn't seem disappointed. He just grinned and ran back to his brother, their giggles mixing with the soft patter of water on grass. Even Liam, usually more reserved, was beaming as he chased his twin through the spray. When it was time to leave, Evelyn walked slowly to her car, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sound of small feet padding on concrete made her turn. Liam and Lucas stood at the edge of the driveway, their clothes still damp, their smiles bright enough to rival the setting sun. As she slipped into the driver's seat, she caught their reflection in her rearview mirror. They were waving enthusiastically, their small hands moving back and forth in perfect sync, as only twins could manage. Without hesitation, Evelyn lifted her own hand and waved back, watching their smiles grow even wider. The gesture felt natural, as if she'd been waving goodbye to these boys her whole life. Evelyn sat at her oak desk Monday morning, meticulously reviewing a stack of court files. The familiar routine calmed her after a difficult week. She reached for her lukewarm coffee when Patricia rushed in, her face pale with worry. Judge Monroe, you must see this, Patricia said, her hand shaking as she placed a document on Evelyn's paperwork. Evelyn's brow furrowed as she picked up the paper. What is this? She asked, her voice flat. A custody petition. For Liam and Lucas Carter. Evelyn's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. She carefully set it down, her hands surprisingly steady as she read. The name Vanessa Carter, biological aunt of the twins, leapt out at her. When did this arrive? Evelyn asked, her voice strained. This morning. She's their father's sister, Patricia explained, shifting nervously. There's something else. I checked her background. It's not spotless. Legally, though, she's family. Evelyn felt a tightness in her chest. Family. The word felt like a punch to the gut. She grabbed her phone, dialing Melissa Grant's number with more force than she intended. The social worker answered on the third ring. Judge Monroe? Unexpected. Vanessa Carter. Tell me everything. A pause. Ah. The petition. Melissa's voice was frustratingly neutral. It seems legitimate. She's their only living relative who stepped forward. Her background? Evelyn pressed. Minor offenses. Nothing to automatically disqualify her, Melissa said, clearing her throat. The court will likely take her seriously. Blood relatives are usually prioritized. Evelyn's free hand clenched. Even with her record? Without proof she's unfit, yes. Family reunification is a top priority, Melissa replied. The words hit Evelyn like a ton of bricks. Everything, removing the twins from the group home, keeping them safe, watching them start to trust, could be ripped away by this woman's claim. I need all Ms. Carter's records on my desk in an hour, Evelyn commanded, her voice sharp. Right away, Your Honor, Melissa responded. The call ended. Evelyn stared at the petition until the words blurred. She'd been so sure she was doing the right thing. So focused on protecting Liam and Lucas. But now? Patricia watched her anxiously. What will you do? Evelyn couldn't answer. For the first time, she felt utterly helpless. The law she'd dedicated her life to felt like a weapon aimed at her heart, and at two little boys who'd already suffered too much. Evelyn's heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she paced back and forth in her office. The custody petition for Liam and Lucas lay spread across her desk, its official letterhead seeming to mock her efforts of the past week. She had fought so hard to protect these boys from a broken system, only to have that same system potentially hand them over to a stranger who happened to share their blood. Her hand trembled as she brushed away a stray hair from her face, fighting to maintain her usual composure. Patricia knocked softly before entering, clutching a manila folder to her chest like it contained toxic waste. I pulled Vanessa Carter's records. She placed the folder on Evelyn's desk with careful precision, her lips pressed into a thin line. It's not great. Actually, it's worse than we expected. Evelyn sank into her chair and opened the file. Her eyes scanned the pages, each detail making her stomach twist tighter. Vanessa Carter, age 34, had a string of arrests for drug possession. Multiple eviction notices painted a picture of financial instability. Most telling of all, she hadn't made any attempt to contact the twins since their parents' death. The dates and details blurred together into a damning portrait of neglect. She hasn't even tried to see them, Evelyn muttered, her voice tight with anger. Not once in over a year. What kind of aunt doesn't even send a birthday card? Patricia leaned against the desk, arms crossed, her expression sympathetic but resigned. If she can prove she's reformed, steady job, clean drug tests, stable housing, the court might still side with her. Blood relatives usually get preference. You know how the system works. This isn't about the boys. Evelyn's fingers crumpled the edge of the paper, leaving permanent creases in the document. She wants them for the state check, nothing more. These children aren't lottery tickets. I know that, Patricia said softly, reaching out to touch Evelyn's shoulder. But the law doesn't care about motivation. It cares about biological ties. We've seen this before. Evelyn stared at Vanessa's mugshot, trying to imagine Liam and Lucas in this woman's care. The thought made her physically ill. She had seen the bruises on Liam's arms, heard Lucas's frightened whimpers in the middle of the night. They were finally starting to feel safe, to laugh and play like normal children. Just yesterday, Lucas had actually smiled at breakfast, a real smile that reached his eyes. There has to be something we can do, Evelyn said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Her throat felt tight, as if she might cry for the first time in years. Patricia shook her head, her face etched with concern. Unless she fails the background check or we can prove she's an immediate danger to the children, her claim as their aunt carries significant weight. The system isn't perfect, but it's what we have to work with. Evelyn sat down heavily in her chair, gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. For the first time since this battle began, real fear crept into her heart. She might lose them. After everything, after breaking down her own walls, after fighting the system, after letting herself care again, she might lose them to someone who saw them as nothing more than a paycheck. The thought of their empty beds, their quiet rooms, threatened to shatter what remained of her carefully constructed composure. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Walkers' front porch as Liam and Lucas sat side by side, their small feet dangling over the edge. Their eyes were fixed on the street, waiting. They had started doing this every morning, hoping to catch a glimpse of Judge Monroe's car. The gentle creaking of the porch swing behind them marked time like a metronome as they watched and waited. When her silver sedan pulled up to the curb, both boys straightened. But as Evelyn stepped out, something in her expression made their smiles fade. Her shoulders were tense, her movements careful and measured. The boys had learned to read adults well, they knew when bad news was coming. Years in the system had taught them that particular skill all too well. "Good morning," Evelyn said softly, climbing the porch steps. Her throat felt tight as she watched their eager faces shift to worry. The familiar warmth in their eyes dimmed, replaced by a wariness that broke her heart. She knelt down in front of them, her black robes pooling around her feet. "There's been a development in your case." The formal words felt wrong, too cold for these two small boys who had already been through so much. She could see them bracing themselves, like tiny soldiers preparing for battle. Liam's face closed off immediately, that practiced mask of indifference that no 5-year-old should know how to wear. Lucas pressed closer to his brother, fingers curling into Liam's sleeve. His other hand found its way to his mouth, teeth worrying at his thumbnail, a nervous habit she'd noticed before. "A woman has come forward," Evelyn continued, trying to keep her voice steady. "She's your aunt." The silence that followed was deafening. The boys didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. The morning birds continued their cheerful song, oblivious to the weight of the moment. "She wants custody of you both." Lucas's lip began to tremble. "But we don't know her," he whispered, voice small and frightened. His eyes darted to the front door of the Walker home, as if memorizing it. Liam's eyes were wide with panic, darting between Evelyn's face and the safety of his brother. "Do we have to go?" His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the fear beneath his brave facade. The question hung in the air. Evelyn's hands clenched in her lap. She wanted to promise them they could stay, that she would protect them. But she couldn't lie, not to these boys who had already been failed by so many adults. Not when they'd learned to spot false promises from a mile away. "I don't know yet," she admitted, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. The law sometimes favors blood relatives. Even saying it felt like a betrayal. Lucas's eyes filled with tears. Liam wrapped an arm around his brother's shoulders, but his own chin trembled. Their matching blue sweaters, carefully chosen by their foster mother that morning, suddenly seemed to highlight their vulnerability. As Evelyn stood to leave, her heart heavy with the weight of their fear, Lucas's tiny fingers wrapped around her wrist. His touch was featherlight, as if afraid she might pull away. The warmth of his small hand sent a jolt through her carefully maintained professional distance. "Please," he whispered, "don't let her take us." Evelyn looked down at those small fingers on her wrist, at the desperate hope in both boys' eyes. Her chest ached with a pain she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 15 years. The morning sun caught the tears in Lucas's eyes, making them shine like tiny stars of hope and fear. Evelyn's office was eerily quiet as she pored over legal documents, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. Stacks of law books surrounded her like a fortress, their leather spines cracked and worn from years of use. Each page only confirmed what she already knew: blood relatives had strong legal standing in custody cases, a fact that made her stomach churn. She rubbed her temples, fighting off a headache that had been building since dawn. The coffee on her desk had gone cold hours ago, the dark liquid reflecting her tired face. Patricia, her ever-faithful assistant, had left 3 fresh cups throughout the morning, but Evelyn hadn't touched any of them. Her mind was too focused on finding something, anything, that could help the boys who had unexpectedly worked their way into her heart. Then it hit her like a bolt of lightning. She sat up straight, reaching for her phone with renewed energy. Her fingers moved quickly as she scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed, one she hadn't dialed in years. Frank Delaney Investigations. A gruff voice answered on the 3rd ring, familiar despite the passage of time. "Frank, it's Judge Monroe." There was a pause, heavy with recognition. "Evelyn? Haven't heard from you in what, 5 years? I need your help." She kept her voice steady, professional, though her hands were shaking. "I need you to look into someone. Vanessa Carter." Frank cleared his throat, the sound scratchy through the phone line. "What kind of look are we talking about?" "Everything. Criminal record, financial history, current situation. I need to know if she's hiding anything that would make her an unfit guardian. Leave no stone unturned." "Guardian?" Frank's chair creaked as he leaned back. This about a custody case? Can you do it or not? Her patience was wearing thin. Digging into people's pasts can be messy, Judge. You sure about this? It's not exactly standard procedure. Evelyn's grip tightened on the phone until her knuckles turned white. She thought of Liam's bruises from the group home, of Lucas's trembling voice asking her not to let them go. The memory steeled her resolve. Find me something, she repeated, her voice hard with determination. All right, Frank sighed, a sound full of concern. But this isn't like you, Evelyn. Getting personally involved. Just find me something, she cut him off. Whatever it takes. Time is not on our side. She hung up the phone, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. The clock on her wall ticked loudly, marking each precious second that slipped away. She knew she had started a dangerous game, one that could either save the twins or destroy her career. The weight of that decision pressed down on her shoulders. But looking at their case file, seeing their small faces in the photos, Liam's guarded expression and Lucas's hopeful eyes, she knew she had no choice. The system had failed them once, leaving scars both visible and hidden. She wouldn't let it happen again, even if it meant crossing lines she'd spent her entire career defending. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Evelyn took her usual seat, though today felt different. Instead of wielding the gavel, she sat watching Judge Harrison preside over the case. Her black robes felt heavier than usual. Liam and Lucas huddled together on the wooden bench, their small shoulders pressed against each other. Lucas's bottom lip trembled as he whispered something to Liam, who squeezed his brother's hand tighter. Their caseworker sat beside them, but her attention was focused on her phone. Across the aisle, Vanessa Carter sat perfectly poised in a modest blue dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her lawyer, a sharp-suited man named James Mitchell, arranged papers on the table with practiced precision. Vanessa caught Evelyn's eye and smiled sweetly, but something cold lurked behind her expression. The court will now hear arguments regarding the custody petition for Liam and Lucas Carter, Judge Harrison announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. Mitchell rose smoothly, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, my client is these boys' only living blood relative. She has maintained steady employment for the past year and has completed all required parenting classes. He gestured toward Vanessa, who dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She simply wants to give her nephews the stable, loving home they deserve. Melissa Grant took the stand next, her testimony clinical and detached. According to state guidelines, biological family connections should be prioritized when possible. Ms. Carter has met all basic requirements. Evelyn's fingernails dug into her palms under the table. She watched Lucas bury his face in Liam's shoulder, their fear palpable. The boys hadn't spoken a word since entering the courtroom. When her turn came, Evelyn stood slowly. The familiar faces of court staff watched her with curiosity, they'd never seen her on this side of the bench before. She drew in a deep breath, her voice clear and strong. Your Honor, the law exists to protect children, not to satisfy adult desires. Liam and Lucas Carter have never met Vanessa Carter. They have no emotional connection to her. They have explicitly expressed fear at the prospect of living with a stranger. She gestured toward the twins, who looked up at the sound of their names. These boys need stability, security, and most importantly, love. Blood relation alone does not guarantee any of these things. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting such passion from the normally stoic Judge Monroe. Vanessa's smile faltered slightly. Both sides have made strong arguments, Judge Harrison said, leaning forward with his hands folded. I will need time to consider all evidence before making my ruling. Evelyn's heart sank as she watched Liam and Lucas being led out of the courtroom, their small faces twisted with worry. The uncertainty in their eyes felt like a physical pain in her chest. Evelyn's office felt smaller than usual as she sat rigid in her chair, watching the clock tick away precious minutes. Her normally steady hands fidgeted with a pen, tapping it against the polished wood of her desk. The waiting was unbearable. When her phone finally rang, she nearly jumped. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she picked up the receiver. Judge Monroe speaking. Delaney here. I found something. Frank's gravelly voice carried a note of satisfaction that made her heart leap. Tell me everything, she said, already reaching for her notepad. Frank cleared his throat. Your suspicions were right. Vanessa Carter's got quite a history she forgot to mention to the court. 3 years ago, she was arrested for fraud. Tried to cash checks in her dead brother's name, the twins' father. Evelyn's pen froze mid-word. The twins' father? She tried to steal from him? That's not all, Frank continued. She's got connections to known drug dealers in the area. Nothing concrete enough for charges, but there are multiple witness statements placing her at known drug houses within the last year. Evelyn scribbled furiously, her legal mind already forming arguments. She'll try to dismiss this as ancient history. Yeah, she'll play the reformed sinner card, Frank agreed. But here's the kicker, I found bank records. She's practically broke. Filed for bankruptcy last month. The timing of her custody claim lines up perfectly with when she'd qualify for state benefits as the twins' guardian. The pieces clicked into place. Evelyn's grip tightened on the phone. She doesn't want the boys. She wants the money that comes with them. Exactly. Look, she'll try to spin this as past mistakes, claim she's changed. But the evidence is clear, she's after the benefits, not the kids. Relief washed over Evelyn like a cool wave. Finally, she had something concrete. Something that could stop Vanessa from taking the twins. Her voice steadied as she asked, "Can you get me all the documentation?" "Already compiled. I'll have it on your desk within the hour." Evelyn closed her eyes, letting out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you, Frank. This changes everything. Good luck, Judge." "Give her hell." She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the past few days lifting slightly from her shoulders. For the first time since Vanessa Carter had appeared, Evelyn felt like she could breathe again. Looking at Samuel's photo on her desk, she whispered, "I won't let her hurt them." She straightened her robes and exhaled deeply. Now she had what she needed to protect Liam and Lucas, real evidence that their aunt was unfit to care for them. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as people filed in, filling every available seat. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Liam and Lucas sat in the front row, their small hands locked together so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Their matching blue sweaters seemed too big for their tiny frames, making them look even more vulnerable. Evelyn watched from her position, noting how Lucas kept glancing at the door, his free hand fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. Liam remained still as a statue, his young face set in a determination that no 5-year-old should have to show. The door opened with a heavy creak, and Vanessa Carter strode in. She wore a conservative navy dress and pearl earrings, the perfect picture of respectability. But Evelyn didn't miss the slight tightness around her mouth, the way her fingers clenched her designer purse a little too hard. The woman knew something was coming. Vanessa's lawyer, James Morrison, stood up first. His voice filled the courtroom with practiced smoothness. "My client has shown remarkable growth. She has maintained steady employment for the past year. She has attended counseling. She deserves a second chance." He gestured toward Vanessa, who dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "These boys need their family, their blood. Ms. Carter is ready to provide that." Evelyn waited patiently, letting them present their case. She watched the judge's face remain impassive, giving nothing away. When it was finally her turn, she rose slowly, deliberately. The room fell silent. "Your Honor," Evelyn began, her voice clear and strong. "Vanessa Carter presents herself as a reformed woman seeking to reunite with her family. But the evidence tells a different story." She pulled out a document from her folder. 3 years ago, Ms. Carter attempted to cash checks in her deceased brother's name, the father of these boys. She has multiple connections to known drug dealers, which she failed to disclose in her petition. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Vanessa's face drained of color, and her lawyer shuffled his papers nervously. "These boys," Evelyn continued, gesturing to Liam and Lucas, "deserve more than empty promises. They deserve more than someone who sees them as a path to state benefits. They deserve stability, security, and genuine love, not an opportunist looking for financial gain." More gasps filled the room. Vanessa's hands trembled as she leaned over to whisper urgently to her lawyer. The judge raised his eyebrows, studying the documents before him with renewed interest. After what felt like hours, the judge looked up, folding his hands carefully on the bench. "I've heard compelling arguments from both sides today," he said slowly. "However, Given the new evidence presented, I need time to review everything thoroughly. I will deliver my verdict tomorrow morning. Evelyn released a slow, controlled breath. One more night of uncertainty. One more night of waiting. The morning sunlight filtered through the high courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the tense faces of everyone present. Evelyn sat at the bench, her fingers pressed against the smooth wooden surface, trying to steady her racing heart. The familiar scent of old law books and polished wood filled her nostrils, but today everything felt different. Liam and Lucas huddled together in their seats, their small hands intertwined. Lucas's lower lip trembled slightly, while Liam's jaw was set in that determined way she'd come to recognize. Their social worker sat beside them, her face carefully neutral. Judge Thompson adjusted his glasses, shuffling the papers before him. The rustling sound seemed deafening in the silent courtroom. Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she waited. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Thompson began, his voice steady and clear, "I have reached my decision." He paused, looking directly at the boys. While biological ties are important, the child's best interest is paramount. The evidence against Ms. Carter is troubling and raises concerns about her intentions. The silence grew heavier. Evelyn noticed Lucas squeeze his brother's hand tighter. "I am ruling in favor of keeping Liam and Lucas Carter in their current placement." The words hung in the air for a moment before the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Lucas's eyes welled up with tears, but these were different from the scared tears Evelyn had seen before. Liam let out a small gasp, his shoulders relaxing for what seemed like the first time in weeks. "This is ridiculous." Vanessa shot up from her chair, her face contorted with rage. "They're my family. My blood. You can't do this." Her lawyer tried to grab her arm, but she yanked it away. "I have rights. Ms. Carter," Judge Thompson's voice cut through her outburst like steel, "any further disruption will result in contempt charges." Vanessa's face flushed red with anger, but she sank back into her chair, shooting venomous glares across the room. The twins instinctively moved closer to where Evelyn sat, as if seeking shelter from their aunt's fury. Lucas wiped his eyes with his sleeve while Liam stood protectively close to his brother. Judge Thompson turned to Evelyn, his expression softening slightly. "Arrangements will be made for the adoption process." Evelyn nodded, trying to keep her hands from shaking as she gripped the edge of the bench. It was over. They were staying. The battle she'd fought so hard to win was finally finished. Vanessa's palms hit the wooden table with a thunderous crack that echoed through the courtroom. Her face twisted with rage, teeth bared like a cornered animal. "This is a joke. They're my family." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Ms. Carter, please control yourself." In their seats, Liam and Lucas pressed closer together, their small shoulders touching. Lucas buried his face in his brother's shoulder while Liam watched the adults with wide, fearful eyes. Their matching blue sweaters, gifts from Margaret Walker, trembled with each sharp breath they took. "Your Honor," Vanessa's lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his tie nervously. "We'd like to request. The decision is final." The judge's voice cut through the air like steel. "Any further arguments can be filed through proper channels." Vanessa spun around, her long dark hair whipping through the air as she fixed her gaze on Evelyn. Her eyes blazed with hatred, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "You think you've won? You think they'll love you more than blood?" Evelyn stood perfectly still, her spine straight, her expression calm. She met Vanessa's glare without flinching. "Love isn't a competition," she said quietly but firmly. "It's a choice." As if responding to her words, Liam and Lucas slid from their chairs. Their small feet patted across the courtroom floor as they moved toward Evelyn, instinctively seeking her presence. Lucas reached for the hem of her robe while Liam stood slightly in front, as if trying to protect his brother. "This isn't over," Vanessa hissed as Officer Harris, the bailiff, took her arm. "You can't just." "Ma'am," Officer Harris's voice was firm. "It's time to leave." As the bailiff guided Vanessa toward the exit, she continued muttering threats under her breath, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her lawyer followed, clutching his briefcase, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The judge watched them leave before turning his attention back to Evelyn. His expression softened slightly as he looked at the boys now standing close to her. "Arrangements will be made for the adoption process." Evelyn nodded, feeling her hands tremble slightly at her sides. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was steady, even as her heart raced beneath her judicial robes. It was over. They were staying. Lucas's tiny fingers tightened in the fabric of her robe while Liam remained standing guard, his small frame somehow looking both vulnerable and protective at once. The courtroom had fallen silent except for the distant sound of Vanessa's angry voice fading down the hallway. Evelyn sat at her mahogany desk, her fingers hovering over the crisp white document that would change everything. Her name was typed neatly beside Liam and Lucas's, the formal paperwork for legal guardianship. The morning sun streamed through her office window, making the official seal gleam. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Patricia poked her head in, her usual professional demeanor softened by a warm smile. "They're waiting for you." Evelyn's heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked into Judge Thompson's chambers. Her heart skipped when she saw Liam and Lucas perched on the leather chairs, their little legs swinging back and forth. They wore matching blue button-down shirts and khaki pants, outfits Margaret Walker had helped them pick specially for today. Margaret and David stood nearby, beaming with pride. They had been incredible temporary foster parents, giving the boys stability when they needed it most. David gave Evelyn an encouraging nod. Judge Thompson, a kind-faced woman in her 60s, sat behind her desk with the adoption papers laid out before her. "Are you ready, Judge Monroe?" Evelyn knelt down beside the twins, her voice gentler than it had been in 15 years. "Are you ready?" Liam and Lucas nodded eagerly, their brown eyes shining with excitement. Lucas couldn't stop fidgeting with his shirt collar while Liam kept straightening his posture, trying to look grown-up. With steady hands, Evelyn picked up the pen. She signed her name on each marked line, the scratching of the pen the only sound in the room. Judge Thompson reviewed each page carefully before pressing her official stamp onto the documents. "It's official," Judge Thompson announced warmly. "They're yours." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes as Liam and Lucas launched themselves into her arms. Their small bodies collided with hers, nearly knocking her backward. She held them tight, breathing in the scent of their shampoo and feeling their hearts beating against her chest. "Thank you," Lucas whispered into her neck. "We love you," Liam added softly. Later, as Evelyn drove them home in her silver sedan, Lucas's small voice came from the back seat. "Can we call you Mommy now?" Evelyn choked back a sob, her vision blurring with tears of joy. "Yes, sweetheart. You can." The house felt different the moment they stepped through the door. The usual silence that greeted Evelyn was replaced by excited footsteps and childish gasps of wonder. Liam and Lucas darted from room to room, their eyes wide with amazement at their new home. "This is all ours?" Liam asked, his small hand trailing along the wall as he explored. "Ours," Evelyn confirmed, watching them discover each space. The word felt right on her tongue, warm and true. The boys raced upstairs, their footsteps thundering on the wooden steps. Each bedroom door swung open as they investigated, claiming their territories with gleeful shouts. They bounced on beds, opened closets, and pressed their faces against windows to see the view. "Can I have this one?" Lucas called from the blue room. "And I want this one," Liam shouted from across the hall. Evelyn watched them settle in, amazed at how naturally they belonged here. The house that had felt like a museum of memories for so long was suddenly alive with laughter and movement. At dinner time, they gathered around the dining table, a space that had been empty for far too long. Liam paused while setting the plates, holding an extra one in his small hands. "Can we set a place for Samuel?" he asked quietly. "Since he's our brother now too?" Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "We can do that." They placed the extra plate together, and Lucas carefully folded a napkin beside it. The gesture was so pure, so accepting, that Evelyn had to blink back tears. When bedtime came, she helped them into their pajamas and tucked them into their new beds. She read them a story, something she hadn't done in 15 years, and kissed their foreheads. "Sweet dreams," she said, reaching for the light switch. Lucas's sleepy voice followed her. "Good night, Mommy." The words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. For the first time since losing Samuel, Evelyn felt complete, whole again. The empty spaces in her heart that had ached for so long were finally filled with love once more. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow on the chaos before Evelyn. She had jolted awake to unfamiliar sounds, the clatter of pots, muffled giggles, and what sounded suspiciously like her entire pantry being reorganized. When she reached the kitchen doorway, she froze. Flour covered nearly every surface, including her new son's. Lucas stood on a chair, carefully trying to pour syrup into a bowl while Liam attempted to crack eggs, most of which had landed on the counter rather than in the mixing bowl. "We wanted to surprise you," Liam announced proudly, his face beaming despite the white powder dusting his dark curls. A sound bubbled up from deep within Evelyn's chest, unfamiliar at first, then growing stronger. Laughter. Real, unrestrained laughter that she hadn't felt in 15 years. The boys looked startled for a moment, then joined in, their giggles filling the kitchen with joy. "Here, let me help," Evelyn said, still chuckling as she moved to steady Lucas's hand on the syrup bottle. "How about we make these pancakes together?" She guided their small hands, showing them how to measure flour properly, how to crack eggs without getting shells in the batter. Lucas insisted on adding chocolate chips, while Liam carefully stirred the mixture with intense concentration. For the first time in years, Evelyn didn't check her watch or worry about her schedule. The morning stretched before them, sweet and unhurried. They made shapes with the pancake batter, some resembling clouds, others looking more like abstract art. Each attempt was celebrated, even the ones that ended up slightly burnt. As they sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by their creative breakfast efforts, Evelyn looked at her flour-covered sons. Their faces glowed with happiness and belonging. She knelt between their chairs, gently cupping their faces in her hands. "This is your home now," she said softly, her heart full. "Forever." The cardboard box felt heavy in Evelyn's hands as she pulled it from the dusty corner of her storage room. She hadn't touched it in 15 years, but she knew exactly what was inside. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing stacks of colorful paper, Samuel's drawings. She sank to the floor, picking up the first one, a crayon masterpiece of their old family, stick figures with wild yellow hair and enormous smiles. Samuel had been so proud of that one, insisting they hang it on the fridge for months. Another drawing showed a red fire truck with wobbly wheels. Samuel had gone through a phase where he wanted to be a firefighter. He'd drawn dozens of trucks, each one slightly better than the last. Evelyn traced the childish lines with her fingertip, remembering how his tongue would stick out in concentration as he worked. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway made her look up. Liam and Lucas stood in the doorway, watching her curiously. "What are those?" Lucas asked softly. Evelyn patted the floor beside her. "Come here, boys. I want to show you something." They settled on either side of her, peering into the box. Evelyn pulled out a drawing of a dragon with mismatched wings and showed it to Liam. "Samuel loved to draw, just like you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He would spend hours creating these wonderful pictures." Liam's eyes lit up as he studied the drawing. "Really? Was he good at it?" "He got better every day, just like you do." Liam beamed, running his fingers over the dragon's crooked scales. "Maybe he can teach me in my dreams." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She pulled both boys closer, kissing the tops of their heads. "Maybe he can, sweetheart." Lucas picked up another drawing, a beach scene with a giant sun wearing sunglasses. He giggled. "This one's funny." Samuel loved making silly pictures, Evelyn explained, finding herself smiling at the memory. "He always said art should make people happy." They spent the next hour going through the box, Evelyn sharing stories about each drawing. For the first time, talking about Samuel didn't feel like reopening a wound. Instead, it felt like introducing her sons to their brother. Lucas crawled into her lap, wrapping his small arms around her neck. "He would have loved us too, huh?" Evelyn smiled through her tears, holding him close. "Yes. He would have." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light across the breakfast table. Evelyn watched as Liam and Lucas pushed their scrambled eggs around their plates, their forks making quiet scraping sounds against the ceramic. Neither boy had taken more than 2 bites. "You boys okay?" Evelyn asked softly, though she already knew the answer. The first day at a new school was never easy. Lucas glanced up, his brown eyes wide with worry. "What if they don't like us?" Liam crossed his arms over his chest, trying to look tough, but Evelyn could see the tension in his small shoulders. "What if they're mean?" The drive to school felt longer than usual. Evelyn kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching the twins whisper to each other in the backseat. Lucas clutched his new backpack to his chest like a shield, while Liam stared out the window, his jaw set in determination. When they pulled up to the elementary school, children were already flooding the entrance, laughing and running past in groups. Some parents waved goodbye to their kids, while others walked their little ones to the door. Lucas's hand immediately found Evelyn's, gripping it tightly. Liam walked ahead, trying to project confidence, but he kept looking back at Evelyn every few steps, as if making sure she was still there. His new shoes squeaked against the polished hallway floor. A group of kids rushed past them, their excited chatter echoing off the walls. Lucas pressed closer to Evelyn's side, while Liam's steps faltered slightly. Evelyn knelt down in front of them both, her black judge's robe traded for a simple blouse and slacks. She looked each boy in the eye, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to be the best. You just have to be you. That's enough." The twins nodded, some of the tension leaving their shoulders. But Lucas still hadn't let go of her hand, and his lower lip trembled slightly. That evening, they sat together on the living room couch, the boys still in their school uniforms. Lucas snuggled close to Evelyn's side, his small body warm against hers. "Can you be there every day?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn wrapped an arm around him, pulling him closer. "As often as I can, sweetheart." Sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains as Evelyn shuffled down the hallway, still groggy from sleep. The house was unusually quiet for a Sunday morning, no cartoons blaring from the living room TV, no sounds of the boys' usual wrestling matches. Her heart skipped a beat until she heard muffled giggles coming from the kitchen. As she rounded the corner, two small figures jumped out from behind the counter. "Happy Mother's Day!" Liam and Lucas shouted together, their faces beaming with pride as they held up handmade cards covered in crayon scribbles and generous amounts of glitter. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. For 15 years, she had dreaded this day, keeping herself busy with work or sleeping through it entirely. Now here she stood, face to face with two bright-eyed boys who had somehow managed to piece her broken heart back together. "We made you breakfast," Lucas announced, pointing to the kitchen table where two pieces of toast sat on her favorite plate, drowning in strawberry jelly that dripped onto the tablecloth. "And cards," Liam added, thrusting his creation into her hands. The front showed three stick figures holding hands, one tall with black robes, clearly meant to be her, and two smaller ones with matching smiles. Inside, in wobbly letters, "You are the best mommy ever. Love, Liam." Lucas's card featured a house with a giant heart above it, and inside he had written, "We love you so much. Thank you for choosing us. Love, Lucas." Evelyn's vision blurred as she read their messages. The last Mother's Day card she had received was from Samuel, a store-bought one with a teddy bear on the front that still sat in her bedside drawer. She had thought she would never celebrate this day again, never feel anything but grief when May rolled around. But here she was, standing in her kitchen with jelly dripping onto her floor, while two little boys watched her anxiously, waiting for her reaction. Their faces showed such pure love and hope, the same expression she used to see on Samuel's face. "Do you like it?" Lucas asked nervously, fidgeting with the hem of his pajama shirt. "The toast is kind of messy," Liam admitted, looking down at his feet. "But we tried really hard." Evelyn knelt down, opening her arms wide. The boys rushed into her embrace, their small bodies warm against hers. She could smell the strawberry jelly in their hair and feel glitter transferring from their hands onto her robe, but she didn't care. "This is the best Mother's Day ever," she whispered, holding them tight as happy tears rolled down her cheeks. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Evelyn's desk as she methodically sorted through legal documents. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency until they brushed against a cream-colored envelope. Her hand froze. The return address made her stomach clench, Vanessa Carter. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before carefully opening the envelope. Inside was the official court response to Vanessa's final appeal attempt. Evelyn's eyes scanned the formal language, her shoulders gradually relaxing as she absorbed each word. Appeal denied. Final ruling. No further contestation permitted. She set the paper down, letting out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. After months of looking over her shoulder, wondering if Vanessa would find another legal loophole, it was finally, truly over. Through her office window, she could hear Liam and Lucas laughing in the backyard. The sound drew her to stand up and walk closer to the glass. The boys darted around the grass, mason jars in hand, trying to catch the first fireflies of the evening. Their giggles floated up to her window as Lucas nearly tripped over his own feet chasing a particularly bright flash of light. Evelyn's fingers traced the edge of the envelope. One day, they might ask questions. They might wonder about their aunt, about their biological family's history. She glanced back at her desk, at the locked bottom drawer where she kept important documents. Walking back, she unlocked the drawer and carefully placed Vanessa's appeal papers inside, alongside the other records of their case. She wouldn't hide it from them, but she wouldn't burden them with it either. When they were older, if they wanted to know, everything would be there. Lucas's voice carried through the window. "Look, Liam. I caught one." Evelyn turned back to watch them. Liam was holding the jar while Lucas carefully transferred his captured firefly. Their heads bent together, both completely absorbed in their small adventure, safe and secure in their world. For the first time since the adoption, Evelyn felt the last bit of tension leave her shoulders. No more looking over her shoulder. No more preparing for the next legal battle. They were safe. They were home. They were hers. She pressed her palm against the cool window glass, watching her sons chase the dancing lights in the growing dusk. The fight was over. They had won. The warm glow of Christmas lights filled the living room as Liam and Lucas circled the tree, their small hands carefully placing ornaments on every branch they could reach. The scent of freshly baked cinnamon cookies wafted through the house, mixing with the pine fragrance of the tree. "Almost done," Liam announced proudly, stretching on his tiptoes to hang a glittering snowflake near the top. His tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, reminding Evelyn so much of Samuel that her heart skipped a beat. Lucas stepped back, admiring their work. His bright smile suddenly faltered as his eyes drifted to the fireplace. "Wait," he said softly, tugging at Evelyn's sleeve. "We forgot Samuel's stocking." Evelyn's body tensed. The familiar ache in her chest returned, but it felt different now, less sharp, more bittersweet. She watched as Lucas's big brown eyes searched her face, waiting. "He's our brother too, right?" Liam chimed in, moving closer to stand beside Lucas. His small hand found hers, squeezing gently. "You said family is forever." Evelyn swallowed hard, fighting back tears. But these weren't the bitter tears of grief she'd grown used to over the years. These were something else, something warmer, fuller. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, he is." Together, they walked to the box of Christmas decorations. At the bottom lay a red stocking, slightly faded but still beautiful, with Samuel embroidered in gold thread. Evelyn's hands trembled as she lifted it out. Lucas ran his fingers over the letters. "It's pretty," he said softly. "Like the ones you got us." Liam helped her hang it on the mantel, right between their own newer stockings. The three of them stood back, looking at the row of stockings, 4 now, instead of 3. Complete. That evening, they curled up on the couch near the fireplace. The Christmas tree lights twinkled, casting soft shadows on the walls. Steam rose from their mugs of hot cocoa, topped with extra marshmallows, just the way Samuel used to like it. Lucas snuggled closer to Evelyn, his head resting against her shoulder. "Do you think Samuel likes the tree we made?" "I think he loves it," Evelyn replied, running her fingers through his curls. Her eyes drifted to the stockings, and for the first time in 15 years, the sight didn't make her want to look away. Instead, she smiled softly, feeling the warmth of her boys pressed against her sides. Christmas had always been Samuel's favorite holiday. Now, watching Liam and Lucas sip their cocoa and point out their favorite ornaments, she realized it could be her favorite again too. Not because she had forgotten, but because she had learned to remember differently, with love instead of loss, with joy instead of pain. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow across their faces. For the first time in years, Christmas felt exactly as it should, like home. Evelyn sat in the familiar courthouse, but everything felt different. Instead of her black judge's robe, she wore a navy blue dress. Instead of sitting behind the bench, she sat in one of the chairs usually reserved for others. And instead of maintaining her usual stern composure, she couldn't stop smiling. Liam and Lucas sat across from her, their feet swinging back and forth, unable to reach the floor. They wore matching button-down shirts and khaki pants, their curly black hair neatly combed. Lucas hummed softly, something he still did when excited, while Liam kept straightening his collar, trying to look grown-up. "Are you nervous?" Evelyn asked softly. Liam shook his head firmly. "Nope. We've been practicing writing our new names all week. I can do it with my eyes closed now," Lucas added proudly, then demonstrated by squeezing his eyes shut and writing in the air with his finger, "Lucas Monroe." The clerk approached with a stack of papers, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Here we are," she said warmly, laying out the new birth certificates. "Just need some signatures from our young men here." Liam and Lucas leaned forward eagerly, their eyes wide as they saw their names printed in official black ink, Liam Monroe. Lucas Monroe. Under mother's name was printed clearly, Evelyn Monroe. The judge overseeing the process, Judge Thompson, a kind-faced woman who had known Evelyn for years, smiled from her seat. "Looks like we have two new Monroes." Lucas grabbed the pen first, his tongue sticking out slightly as he concentrated on forming each letter perfectly. Liam watched impatiently, bouncing in his seat until it was his turn. When he finally got the pen, he wrote his name with careful precision, making sure every letter was just right. Evelyn watched them, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She remembered the first time they'd appeared in her courtroom, two terrified little boys clutching each other's hands. Now here they were, confident and happy, signing their names with such pride. The clerk collected the papers, stamping each one with official seals. "Congratulations," she said, handing copies to Evelyn. "Everything's official now." Liam jumped up from his chair, practically bouncing with excitement. He grabbed the paper to look at his name again, then turned to Evelyn with the biggest grin she'd ever seen. "Mommy, we match now." Evelyn pulled both boys close, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart. We match." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front porch as Evelyn adjusted the camera's timer one more time. Liam and Lucas bounced on their heels, dressed in matching blue polo shirts that brought out the warmth in their brown skin. Their excitement was contagious, making Evelyn's hands shake slightly as she fiddled with the settings. "Hold still, you two," she laughed, a sound that had become increasingly common in their home. "We want this to be perfect. Can I sit on your lap, Mommy?" Lucas asked, already moving closer to her. "Me too." Liam chimed in, not wanting to be left out. Evelyn settled into the wooden porch swing, pulling both boys onto her lap. Their combined weight made the swing creak gently, a comfortable sound that had become part of their daily life. The timer beeped its warning, and they all turned to face the camera. "Say cheese," Evelyn called out, wrapping her arms around her sons. The camera clicked several times, capturing their genuine smiles and the love that radiated between them. Later, as Evelyn reviewed the photos on her computer, tears welled up in her eyes. There they were, her family, caught in a moment of pure joy. She chose the best photo and had it professionally framed, an elegant silver frame that matched the one holding Samuel's picture. Standing before the mantel, Evelyn carefully placed the new family portrait next to her firstborn's photograph. The two frames stood together, bridging past and present, loss and love. Liam tugged at her sleeve. "Look, Mommy, Samuel's smiling at us too." Evelyn wrapped an arm around him, studying both photos. Where the mantel had once felt like a shrine to her grief, it now told a story of healing and hope. The house that had echoed with emptiness for so many years now rang with laughter, arguments over whose turn it was to set the table, and the constant patter of little feet. That evening, as stars began to peek through the twilight sky, Evelyn went through their bedtime routine. She helped Lucas brush his teeth while Liam insisted on doing his own, though he still missed spots. They changed into their pajamas, dinosaurs for Liam, rockets for Lucas, and climbed into their beds. Evelyn sat on the edge of Lucas's bed first, smoothing his curls back from his forehead. "Good night, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his temple. "Night, Mommy," he mumbled, already half asleep. She moved to Liam's bed, where he was fighting to keep his eyes open. "Good night, my brave boy," she said softly, kissing his forehead too. "Love you, Mommy," he yawned. Standing in the doorway, Evelyn watched her sons drift off to sleep. The nightlight cast a gentle glow across their peaceful faces. "Good night, my boys," she whispered, feeling a completeness she'd never thought possible again. If you enjoyed the story of Evelyn, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.